I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to a video conference edition of the New York Times Close Up. Reports that Donald Trump called fallen soldiers suckers and losers set off a firestorm less than 2 weeks ago. But Bob Woodward's new book, Rage, was an even bigger bombshell because he had tapes of his 18 on-the-record interviews with Trump. Trump, on tape, admitting he downplayed the seriousness of the coronavirus, contradicting everything he was telling the American people. Joe Biden blasted Trump's response to the virus, calling it, quote, a life and death betrayal of the American people. But Trump had famously said that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose a vote. Is that still true? Will people believe that his own voice is fake news? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Meanwhile, Trump's relentless and brutal Biden bashing hasn't made much of a difference in the polls. The latest Economist YouGov poll has Biden up by 9 points. The Fox poll has him up by 5. The national average remains Biden up by 7. With less than 50 days to go before Election Day, is Trump still Teflon Don, or will the Trump tapes cost him votes with swing and suburban voters? We're joined by Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and Reid Epstein, political correspondent for the Times. Peter, you wrote again that the president is saying the virus will go away by itself. Unlike Trump himself, the president is now downplaying it again after admitting that he falsely downplayed it. Where does the president really stand on this? And what is the advantage to him to be saying one thing one day and something else the next?
Look, the one thing the president doesn't want to talk about this fall during the campaign is the coronavirus. It's an issue that is not a winner for him. He knows that no matter how much he tells us that he's done a great job, Americans aren't buying it. The latest ABC Ipsos poll showed only 35% of Americans approve of his handling of the coronavirus. So he would like us to be able to turn the corner. He keeps saying we have rounded the corner on the pandemic. And he wants America to move on, in effect, to focus on other issues, to focus on terrain that he feels like might be more advantageous to him in terms of the campaign. But it's a hard pivot for him to make at a time when the pandemic is, in fact, not going away. Dr. Fauci, the federal government's lead infectious diseases specialist, of course, says that we're not going to get back to normal until mid to late 2021. We have not rounded the corner, he says, in effect. And when you see, infections continue to mount, when you see the death toll at sometimes 1,000 people a day, that's a new 9/11 every 3 days. It's, the president, I think, is sort of talking one way while the country is experiencing something in a different way.
Reid, we're going to start voting for this presidential election very soon with early voting, with mail voting. What have we learned from the primaries so far? We've just had the last one. It's hard to believe that we've had a last primary and we're almost voting in the general election. But what did we learn from the primary this week in Delaware and the primaries up to this point? What does that bode for November?
Well, Sam, general election voting is already starting this week in Minnesota. But one thing that was clear from the primaries, especially some of the primaries once mail balloting started in earnest, is that turnout is way up from the 2016 primaries in a lot of these states. There's a broad expectation that turnout for the November general election will be way up relative to 2016. A lot of these states, especially in states that have made it easier to get an absentee ballot by mail. We saw in Delaware's primary this week for a lightly contested Senate race. The turnout was up by about 30 or 40,000 votes, which in Delaware is about 20% over the 2018 numbers when they had a Senate election that was similarly contested. And so, I think the estimates for total turnout that we're seeing that are based on 2016 and even 2012 numbers are probably going to be pretty low. And just because people, especially who can vote from their own living rooms and return a ballot in a drop box or the mail, are going to find that to be a much easier situation than if they had to go to a polling place.
And who is that going to help or hurt? Large turnout means who are people voting for or against?
It's not certain that we know. A lot of the voting models that we see pollsters use give Joe Biden an edge in high turnout for a high turnout election, but that's one of the questions that we're really not going to know until we have votes counted, which itself may take several days or weeks until after the election.
Peter, we talked about the book by Bob Woodward, 18 interviews with the president on tape. Why did the president talk to Woodward at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. As Karl Rove said, many presidents think that they can manage Bob Woodward and live to regret it. Bob Woodward, of course, Donald Trump, of course, went further than any president before, as he often does with these things. He's sort of like on steroids. You know, President Obama talked with Woodward for one time for each of his 2 books. President Bush talked to Woodward for 3 of the 4 books he wrote about that administration. As you point out, Donald Trump spoke to him 18 times, actually even called him a 19th time after the book was put to bed, couldn't do anything more with it. I think that, you know, it's for Trump, it's this, you know, the inability to resist the flame. You know, Jared Kushner told me he can't help touching the flame. He has to convince people, even people he perceives to be enemies or skeptics, that he is right. He has infinite faith in his capacity for persuasion and marketing himself. And I think that there's sort of this, you know, addictive quality to attention. And if he can talk to Bob Woodward, who's this eminence grise of the Washington media establishment, then that's validating for him. Remember, he's this person who has for a long time throughout his life been pressing his nose up against the glass of the elites, first in New York, now in Washington, always feeling like he never got the respect he deserved. So when a figure like Bob Woodward comes along and says, "I'd like to talk to you," you know, Trump can't help himself and decides he's going to engage.
Is there any reaction from the president to the book yet? Like, why did I ever talk to this guy?
Well, you know, even during the process of talking to Woodward, he understood at times it wasn't going to work out well for him. You know, you can see in the tapes and in the transcripts of the conversations, he'll say something, "Well, I know this is going to turn out to be a bad book for him anyway." Part of that is working the refs. Part of that's trying to, you know, guilt Woodward into being, quote, fairer or more positive toward him. And part of it is, I think, a recognition that he's not going to get, you know, some sort of hagiography out of a guy like Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward took down a president. He's not going to, you know, simply present present the president's point of view, you know, unfiltered. And I think that, you know, Trump is from the old school. Any publicity, you know, spell my name right, good publicity, bad publicity is all better than no publicity.
Reid, Peter just mentioned the Washington establishment. You had a story in the Times the other day pointing out that television advertising in this campaign usually is meant to influence voters in the battleground states. This time it seems in a way more intended to reach a different audience, Washington's opinion makers and the president himself. Why is that?
Well, certainly Republicans and President Trump's campaign have spent an inordinate amount of money on Washington television advertising to make sure that President Trump himself sees it on TV. That's something that we've really never seen before from any campaign. And Democrats, Joe Biden last week introduced a TV ad on Morning Joe on MSNBC, almost in the 6 o'clock hour, a time slot engineered to make sure that the president sees it, almost as if they were trolling President Trump with their ad. You know, it's a weird time that we're in. Both of these campaigns, but primarily President Trump's campaign, have been spending money in ways that don't make a lot of logical sense to people who are professional political operatives. You know, and we'll see. For the Trump campaign and the president himself, their answers to a lot of questions about these things have been, well, we won in 2016 doing it our way. We're going to do it again this time. You know, we'll see. We've got less than 50 days to go to find out if they're right again.
Is Biden, meanwhile, playing it too safe, Peter, by holding back? Or, I mean, he did call Trump a climate arsonist. He has come out with some more aggressive language. But looking forward to the debate coming up the week after next, what do we expect him to do, and how aggressive is he going to be, or should he be?
Yeah, you do hear a lot of hand wringing on the left, a lot of Democrats who are worried that he's not doing enough, that he's losing the Hispanic vote in Florida, needs to get down there, that he's not, doing enough to energize liberals or progressives in the party. You heard Bernie Sanders say that. And you hear sort of a range of Democrats wishing he would be sort of more energetic and active on the campaign trail. But, broadly speaking, I think the polls that you cited suggest that, in fact, what he's doing is more or less working. Why mess with a formula that is producing, a healthy lead? The real trick is going to be this debate. The debate is going to be the first time in a very significant way that this election is about a choice rather than a referendum. For Biden, it's better the longer this race is a referendum about Donald Trump, because if it's a referendum about President Trump, then Trump is not likely to win, according to the polls. What President Trump wants to do, needs to do, hopes to do, is to turn it into a referendum, into a choice in which Biden is an unacceptable alternative to at least a certain number of people who, if not going to vote for him, will at least stay home, the way a lot of Democrats did in 2016 when they decided that they didn't particularly like Hillary Clinton enough. So that debate starting September 29th really, I think, is the first key moment. Reid will know that better than I will, but I think that the head-to-head contest between these two people will be, the next moment when the dynamic could shift, or it may cement the dynamic that we've seen last, in a pretty static way now for weeks on end.
And Sam,
yeah,
I was just going to say, like, one thing that we've seen in some of the Times polling that we've done is that President Trump has succeeded at some level in shifting the discussion about this election away from the coronavirus. In the polling of Wisconsin, which is the probably the most critical battleground state this year, just as many people think that violence in cities is a bigger problem than coronavirus. But yet, even about 20% of people who think that rioting is a bigger problem than racism in the criminal system are still say they're voting for Joe Biden. So while Trump has succeeded in pushing the narrative that he wants this summer and fall, he hasn't necessarily won people over who have agreed with his viewpoints about what are the most important issues.
And Peter, you've written about the fact that the president trying to cast himself as a defender of white America. Is that still a strategy that's going to work? I mean, among other things, we have new census figures going to come out later this year. Hispanic Americans identify themselves more as white than any other race. Is that a strategy that in 2020 is going to be as productive as it has been in prior elections?
Well, it goes against all the thinking that Republicans and Democrats have had for years, which is that, as the country diversifies, as the population becomes increasingly, less white, that catering to, just that part of the electorate seems like a losing strategy. But what it seems like President Trump is trying to do is maximize his turnout, maximize the people who are already either supportive of him or willing to support him, inclined to support him, give them a reason to come out, make sure that they're energized, rather than reaching out to broaden his base. He hasn't spent any part of his presidency trying to broaden his base. The convention recently showed a lot of faces of African-American, Latino-American supporters of President Trump who testified to his strengths and his assets and denied that he was any kind of racist, stood up for him. But in a lot of ways, those appeals were aimed at reassuring, I think, white suburbanites who would like to vote for the president, agree with his policies perhaps, but don't want to see like they're getting in bed with a racist president. This is their way of trying to say it's okay. It's a permission structure in effect for them to vote for him. He's not making great inroads in the African-American community, certainly still in single digits. He's doing better among Hispanics, although Biden is still winning among Hispanics overall, but the president is doing significantly better there than among Black Americans. But it's really it's a curious strategy, and it's really kind of doubling down on what worked 4 years ago in a country that's really different than it was 4 years ago.
different. And also, of course, the popular vote 4 years ago, he did not win.
Right.
Thanks to Peter Baker and Reid Epstein of the New York Times. And coming up next, Nobel Prize winning economist and Times columnist, Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize winning economist, a distinguished professor of economics at the CUNY Graduate Center, and of course, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. His subjects range from the economy to politics to trade and plenty of Donald Trump. A quick sample of headlines from recent columns: Trump and the attack of the invisible anarchists, Trump's racist, statist suburban dream, Trump sends in the economic quacks. Last week, a column headlined "Gross Domestic Misery is Rising" caught our eye. Paul wrote, quote, "I like data as much as, or probably more than the next guy, but an economy's success should be judged not by impersonal statistics, but by whether people's lives are getting better. And the simple fact is that over the past few weeks, the lives of many Americans have gotten much worse." Well, we're happy to have Paul Krugman joining us. Paul, stocks are up. The economy has added jobs in August. The GDP seems to be growing rapidly. So why are things for so many Americans getting worse?
Well, first thing to say is stocks, there's a very, the stock market is not the economy. The stock market is not the economy. The stock market is not the economy. About half, slightly more than half of all stocks are owned by only about 1% of the population. And almost 90% of stocks are owned by the top 10% of the population. Half the public has no stake whatsoever. So the stock market really doesn't matter for the lives of most Americans. Jobs do matter. And we are adding jobs, but much more slowly. We snapped back. We gained about half the jobs we lost during the lockdown, but it's clearly has slowed down a lot since then. And a lot of people have been depending on this lifeline of emergency aid that the US government was providing, that is still very, very much needed. But most of that lifeline got cut off at the end of July. And that's why things are getting worse for a lot of people in America right now.
Is it likely that Congress somehow will revive that lifeline, either Democrats or Republicans?
Well, Democrats already passed a bill to do it. I mean, Democrats passed a bill in May that would have continued the lifeline. It was a very ambitious bill, and it was obviously intended to be the start of a negotiating process. Republicans never came up with a halfway credible alternative, never passed anything. At this point, no. I mean, we're only not much more than a month from the election, and if there's it's too late for anything that happens that is passed in Congress to really affect the election outcome. And given this Congress and the way, particularly this Senate and this party that controls the Senate, there's no way they're going to do anything that is just for the common good if there's no political gain in it.
A lifeline is obviously a temporary solution. And you pointed out in a column the other day that even if Joe Biden does win, he'll have to govern in the face of what seems to be nonstop policy sabotage, as you put it, from his political opponents. So how much will change if the Democrats get elected?
Well, it's going to be a lot, obviously, hinges on Senate control. So if nobody knows how any of the elections is going to go. Biden is clearly favored. The Democrats are maybe slightly favored to take the Senate, but it's nothing like the same odds. And if Republicans hold the Senate, everything indicates they'll just blockade everything. And even if Democrats do take the Senate, there'll be a lot of filibustering, and we'll have to see if that institution survives. I suspect not. But it's really hard. I mean, let's remember, Barack Obama took office in the midst of an economic crisis that was totally obvious. It was, the need for action was overwhelming. We had a highly polarized political system, but this is pre-QAnon. This was a Republican Party that wasn't quite as extreme as it is now. And even so, he got no You know, his initial economic rescue package got 0 Republican votes in the House. This is not. I think Biden is going to have a really. I assume that he and the people around him are aware of this, but it's going to be really hard to govern the country, given the nature both of the crisis we're in and the opposition party.
You also pointed out that when Trump took office, the economy was not in any kind of utopian state either. Parts of the country had persistent economic weaknesses, low employment. There were also problems, social issues of drugs and suicide and alcohol use. So why should we think that the Democrats coming back into office are going to do any better than they did before?
Well, clearly the country was, we were not utopia. And we were a long way from utopia in 2016. On the other hand, more Americans had health insurance than have ever had before. We'd had a dramatic decline in the number of uninsured Americans, which has been, by the way, critically important. Just think of where we would be right now if Obamacare didn't exist. So it was significant progress under Obama. It was sort of, if you like, Obama maybe took us a quarter of the way towards becoming a decent society. That's, but that's in real life, partial success is all you achieve. And if we have a Biden presidency and a democratically controlled Congress, then we're not going to get the grand dreams. I mean, a lot of people like me thought that if we could get everything that Bernie Sanders wants, that would be great, but we're not. And then the question is, what's a realistic strategy to get as much of that agenda as we can? And I think Biden is going to try. All indications are that he's got some pretty progressive people advising him on policy. And so I have hopes, but of course also enormous fears about where we're going.
If Trump gets reelected, given his economic policy team, what's likely to change?
Well, you want to say that there's quick vengeance for having bad people in charge, and often that's not true. Often the economy can, particularly a country like the United States, it's an enormous amount of momentum. The economy goes along. I think the most important thing right now is that there's something that is very much a question of presidential policy, which is how we deal with the pandemic. And Trump has given up. If he was ever inclined to try to do anything about it, he clearly is not now. So the one thing that's clearly going to happen if Trump is reelected is that a lot of people are going to die. I'm much more certain about the mortality rate than I'm about GDP growth under a Trump presidency. And the mortality rate is going to be really bad.
One of the things you brought up, and very few other people are talking about it, is a looming fiscal crisis facing state and local governments. Yeah. What can be done about that, and how big a crisis is that actually are they facing?
Well, it's a huge crisis. I mean, state and local governments are essentially, there's some workarounds a little bit, but basically they, unlike the federal government, have to balance their budgets. And they've taken a huge revenue hit from the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. And they've also got a big increase in expenditures because of programs like Medicaid. So they're in big trouble, and this is bad on multiple fronts. If you ask what do state and local governments spend on, 2/3 of it is either healthcare or education. And the healthcare is pretty much not something you can cut right now. So we're talking about a terrible, terrible hit to education, which means a hit to the future. It's not a problem. I mean, the federal government does not have that constraint. The federal government is able to borrow at incredibly low interest rates. In fact, interest rates that are well below the rate of inflation. So that effectively people are paying the federal government to take their money. And the federal government would have no trouble at all providing a massive aid program. Why we have a federal system. There are reasons for that, but there's no reason at all why any part of the US government taken as a whole should be slashing education spending in the middle of this crisis. We have not become less able to educate our children than we were a year ago. It's only because of the peculiarity of our system and the political fracturing of the country that we're doing it.
Is the Federal Reserve out of solutions at this point?
Well, the Fed has, the Fed is the last remaining bastion of competence we've got. And but there's only so much they can do. I mean, we always used to talk about the Fed policy beyond a certain point is pushing on a string. The Fed can cut interest rates to zero and has done that. It can try some other stuff. It can buy longer term bonds, even corporate bonds, which is doing, but that's already getting a little iffy. But this is not, and particularly this is not, there's nothing, the Fed can't balance the budget of the city of New York. That's not within the Fed's remit. It's not something you can do. It would be great if the Fed could just hand the state of New York $10 billion and say, you know, use it to fill the gaps this year, but that's not something Jay Powell, I think he's a good guy, but it's not something he has the right to do.
Okay, thank you for that optimistic report, Paul, as usual. Paul Krugman of the New York Times and CUNY Graduate Center, thank you for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.